Okay, let's try and see if I can people see that?
Yep.
Okay, welcome everyone to the archive meeting for December. I'll just give a little bit of a preamble. Archive, the SingularityNet archive contains a history of the activities of the SingularityNet Ambassadors Program. All content is provided under open source Apache 2 license, and contributions may be licensed under Creative Commons as well. Our goal is to provide a collaborative platform for the SNet archive community to share knowledge, ideas, and best practices. And we welcome contributions from anyone interested in SingularityNet, whether it's new project, code example, or documentation. So our process is first of all to review action items, which I'll pass over to Vanny soon, and then we come back to the project board to go through issues on the project board. So I hand it over to you, Vanny, for the action and decision items.
Yeah, cool. Let me screen share the summary tool and I'll just whip through what we did last time and what we've got outstanding. So, okay. So yeah, just kind of admin type stuff. We did note that token price is still very low, and if it's no better by the end of the quarter, we said that we might think about paying all those who are owed proportionally. So yeah, we just need to chat with Andre about that, I think, really. Um, we said that there are still issues with the monthly archives GitBook kind of summaries. Yeah, quality is not great and there are issues. And we thought about maybe even closing the archives and just going, look, you don't need to do it anymore. But I think that is something that maybe we should discuss in a bit more detail, like next quarter. But yeah, there are still problems. In the last meeting, we had a little update from Stephen about the work he had been doing up until then on knowledge graph development, and I'll update this to kind of look at it in more detail based on today's. But we were talking about the difference between working with structured data and unstructured data, and the different approaches we need to take, and kind of creating different sections in the repo for graph analysis and data analysis, and stuff like centrality and clustering and degree analysis was something we talked about quite a lot. Um, from that, we discussed the differences between like creating separate reports for different kinds of analysis and what they show. And that led to a further discussion of kind of what people understand from the graph data and what they think it means. And we suggested that there should be, at some point, an archives meeting to engage a group of people in this community with analysing what the graph data is telling us and, what they think it means, to sort of compare the data with our lived experience of being in the ambassador program and to start people thinking a bit. So I think we said we were going to do that, but we didn't say when. So I think that's something we should look at in the new year. I think it would be quite an interesting session and a bit different from the usual um, work group meeting. We also discussed a little bit more about kind of what the data shows and what data we might want to collect and what data we might want to look at. And yeah, we noted that Stephen delivered a successful session on the graph work, knowledge graph work so far in AI Sandbox. That's quite a while ago now, but obviously it's something that we had in from last meeting, which was in October. And we noted that Archives Q3 quarterly report and Q4 budget were approved. And we also noted that for Q1 2026, there will be no formal budget consent process. And we had action items for me to draft and submit, the minimal report for this quarter's work, which I've done, and it's in the um, governance dashboard and lots of tags, and lots of references. So that's about it, really.
I think that's a useful reminder that I need to focus on graph analysis again. Um, as we will see, I focused mostly on development, but without preempting that, I'll go back to Um, Sharing the screen. Can people see the screen? Is that
Yep.
yeah? Yep.
Yep.
Okay, right. Back to project management again. So, shall I start with your issues, Vanny? Because and then we
I
go.
mean, honestly, most of the things that are assigned to me are, yeah, archives, GitBook things. And yeah, it's just because this is not paid anymore. And like,
Yeah.
over Christmas, I'm gonna tidy it all up and get it all sort of approved and sorted in the archives. But yeah, I just don't want to make a mistake with trying to do it. Um,
Okay. Is there anything else you want to cover that's allocated to you, Vanny? There's a couple of ongoing things which I think are housekeeping by Andre, which is automation of town hall
yeah.
summaries, but
I mean,
they're
that can
ongoing
come
issues.
off. That should actually be closed now because it's done and working and up and running.
Is that done? Is it
Yeah,
okay? Okay.
it is. I think the only reason it's still there is that we were looking at what we want to pay, what we're going to pay Andre for it, because we did pay Malik for his actual building of it, but Andre did quite a lot of work with him on making
Okay.
sure it integrated properly. So that's, yeah, maybe leave it open because we still need to sort that out.
Okay. And the
Yeah,
other
other than that, there's
is
just things like workgroup sync calls, and there isn't going to be one for a little while. So yeah, I think over to you, really.
okay. So I'll close. This is a historical issue for. Oh no, sorry, we're into December now. I forgot. So we're now. I put all the work I've done in November, but it's now we're now 10 days into December. So this crosses over into December as well. Okay, so basically, you've been looking at prototyping the replacement for the archive dashboard. And there's a number of steps I did that. First of all, I looked at how to ingest the data and do an archive RAG with the data. And I did some of that on. So the data ingest and pipeline was basically to look at the JSON sources from or look at how we would ingest data from multiple sources into a Superbase schema. This has been, I did a bit of work on this and I ingested data and checked it, but actually it's a bit redundant now because it's been replaced by, I've now got a direct connection with the Superbase data, which I'm going to be using from now on. I'll explain later. The RAG process, I built a RAG using sample JSON data from this year. Um, and I produced an output in Discord. If I can, I'm not sure if I can bring this up on that screen. Which was a Discord bot which produced a verifiable set of citations from answers, but it wasn't completed. I can see if I can do a screen share of that. Um, Stop share. See if I can do a screen share of the um, Discord. I'm just not sure if this will work. And let's go to here. Okay, so what this was I was testing out um, the RAG, the way you set up a RAG or the way I was setting up was a minimal local LNM, which you use to pass data from a discrete source. In this case, it was JSON data, and then another RAG which actually converts that into natural language. And then the way also I was trying to do where any data that you query that you find or ask to query, it creates a citation. So here, for example, this query, list decisions, it then it then returns with citations like here. Well, here's citation data. Obviously, still not completed. Also, with the ability to report, the idea was that you would report, this is not going to work, it's not connected, report any citations that were missing and that kind of thing. So that was the work on that. I'll go back to the dashboard again. Okay, so that was work done on archive rag. That's still, I put that to one on hold for a moment so that I could continue on with doing prototyping for what the dashboard might look like, what a replacement dashboard might look like, how we could make that better and also incorporate graph exploration, exploration, sorry, I can't say that. And I did a prototype dashboard in Python, which would browse work groups, meeting filters, a decision tracker, and a graph explorer, and also allow people to export data. And I did that in Streamlit. It's here. So this is what this will look like. So it's basically how we, I mean, it may not look like this, but it might have this functionality. So this allows you to say, select a work group, let's say archives, select a date, and then it filters what you see by that work group. And also you can filter date ranges, topics, action items. Probably wanted to more filter decision items. Then when you filter by the work group, it'll filter the decisions that are relevant to that work group. So it'll filter that as well, show you what decisions there, and it'll filter the action items. And then it will create a graph of what you filtered as well. So this is a very simple graph at this stage, but it could become more refined depending on what graph queries we do. And that's why that reminder about how to refine graph approaches is relevant, Vanny, what you're talking about. This just looks at a graph. So if you're filtering by, say, a work group, it filters the work people and work groups that are related to archives and the topics. So let's switch over to topics. Has slightly more information here. But obviously, this is very basic, so it would just be somewhere to begin with. So this is just like trying to brainstorm ideas about what a dashboard could look like. Obviously, the interface would be a bit more refined on this. This is just a simulation. Okay, so now we've got to the stage where I forked the dashboard that Andres built, and I'm going to start refining it. So first of all, I've tried to make we're going to make the archive dashboard repo much more open source, much more explanatory, and much more generic if we can as well. So in this fork, I've created better documentation. So as well as getting started, you can see what the architecture is, how the system components work, the API documentation. The API documentation is going to be important because it'll allow interfaces with other AIs as well, and how to contribute, what terms mean, how authentication is set up, and then it gets into something which we will need to focus on, which is how our data is structured. So we have a certain structure at the moment for workgroup data, which is in this template here as JSON, and we have a programmatic means to add that data. There's an explanation of the data templates. These are the current data templates, it's how they work, and tags and so on. This is important because it's important to stabilize what we have at the moment, the data model that we have at the moment, before it's translated a into extended, sorry, into a RAG, because the RAG will ingest this data through various means and will interpret it. We may change the data model to make it more appropriate for a RAG ingestion. And one of the first conversations we're already having at the moment is the difference between keeping normalizing some of the data in SQL and against having some data in JSON or unstructured data. And that's important in terms of how you design a RAG system because an SQ, to speed up, it's important in terms of how tokens may be extracted using generative models. For example, you could just, at the moment, our data is mostly in JSON files, which means that if we were going to do a query, we would actually extract all the JSON and throw that at a generative model, which isn't a very efficient way of doing it. It can create a lot of token overhead. So a better way to do it would be to look at the data that we have in the our meeting structure and identify which should be, you know, traditional SQL because it's just like, a normalized data and then do pre-query those first. So you have a pre-query which gives you some information before you put that to a generative model, which because you don't need to put that information to a generative model, you just need to do an SQL query, and then you can use that SQL query to refine what unstructured data that you have. So, for example, let's say you wanted to ask a question about a documents in an archive work group. In the current system, you'd actually throw all that data, all the JSON data at a generative model, and that would be very inefficient. So it'd be much more efficient to query for archive work group or whatever work group you want, and then that query would then create a subsection of JSON data. So, for example, all the documents associated with the archive work group, and then only that would be then sent to the generative model and then back again. And this same applies for graph queries as well, because the graph query will typically be well, there may be cases where you'll look at the graph of everything, but that won't give people will always want to drill down into data to see graphs that relate to a particular tag, for example, or a particular work group. And that's where you would pre-process some of the data using SQL before you do the graph query. So that's really where we're at. Yes, so we're setting up we set up a development version of the Superbase back end, and this is a forked version. So as you can see, it's 12 commits ahead and 5 commits behind the production version. Okay, I'll stop sharing that. Is there any questions or anything wants me to share?
I think I made a confusing sentence, but what I meant with
Yeah,
that
so
is like, well, right now you said that you were collecting the summary documentations, but are you ever really providing the full JSON, or you have, or with you have a predefined you already create like a data structure of the summary, so you don't even give the raw data of summary itself, but
the
like.
well, the way we're gonna use it is like this. Let's say maybe I do something for illustration. Let's say the structure of the structure of meeting summaries is like we need to look at that first of all, and so let's say something like that. Okay, so look at something like that. This is currently in JSON, so it's like work group, meeting information, agenda items, that kind of thing. So this will act on what we need to discern from this is what can act as a key, what can act as so like an SQL key, something that is there's no point it being in JSON, unstructured JSON. It's much more powerful to have it as, I want to know about this work group. This work group has this ID. This work group has this meeting on such and such a date, that kind of thing. Factual, very normalized data. and to separate out that kind of data from data that is, for want of a better word, unstructured, or more like, for example, maybe narrative. Another example, maybe tags or transcriptions. Um,
I
Data,
understand that, but I
yeah,
found like if we have all of these meeting summaries, w- would we like I guess this is just like a future solution, but when I was learning about RAG stuff, it always came to that whatever data you have, you need to turn it into RAG in order to like maximize its potentiality, even if it's like I don't
yeah,
know, 1,000 tokens. So you use the LLM to create unique key pairs. So
yeah,
one summary may actually differentiate from other because right now you're showing like a standard metadata in order to kind of query or drill down the information. But then there is like rag of rags in a sense, and making
yeah.
each of the summary itself a custom version of a rag model.
The yeah, there. That's kind of it, but also it's not. That maybe like a naive rag. A naive rag where you might just say sample your data. Let's say take some unstructured data. What you need to do is to you do some pre-processing locally first. And that creates, I suppose that's exactly what you're saying, actually. That creates a key index. But that requires, just trying to find an example. S- blah, blah, blah. Information services, data model specification. Um, Trying to think of the data model. Right, okay. So really it's about clarifying what the data model is for the RAG. Okay, so so what you're saying to the RAG is how to validate these fields. I mean, I say fields, in this case, it's applying to JSON entities, but, but to make it more, to speed it up a bit, to make it more efficient because you could do this, but what would be more efficient would be to identify which fields were normalized so you could basically get an answer from an SQL query. Okay. There's no point in getting an AI to ask to return a query that could be done by an SQL query because it's far more faster and more efficient. So that would inform what entities you give to be validated by a RAG. Yeah. So this is a kind of naive RAG because it's taking all the JSON and validating the fields in the JSON. So it's basically saying what you're expecting the RAG to see and validation rules, for example, here. And then it's defining citations. So it's saying take this information and give me back a response using this validation rules and these relationships and tell me yeah, tell me where you sourced it from, basically. So that's really there's also an in, that's the kind of that's almost like a prompt design, really. So basically, you're designing the structure for the prompt to be sent to the back end generative model, like so OpenAI I'm using in this case, but it could be any back end. We would probably use ASI, would be better to use, wouldn't it? So then there's an embedding index that you create locally, and that's using a fast vector index. Okay, and that creates embedding chunks locally. Or in production, we'll probably do something like that on Superbase. And that translates some of this here into an embedding index, which translates the validation rules and the relationships into chunks. Now this is processes that locally. That's an evaluation case. That's a test. Okay, so the ingestion flow in this case, this will change. But in the RAG I collated it, you get a meet, you get the full, as you say, Tilo, you get a full JSON meeting summary at the moment. You validate that as JSON and hash it, and then it goes into a um, chunking, embedding, indexing, and storage. And same with the
But when
query.
you do this chunking, all
Yeah,
that stuff, that happens on the query time. It's not pre-processed at all.
not at the moment, not in this example. What I
Okay.
want to do, that's what I want to change, you see.
Okay.
Because this is still pretty quick actually. So I'm going to change it because it's best practice for production. Also for if we were gonna we want to make this like a generic solution, so it could be scaled, for example. So to do this, it'd be very because you're taking in here in the ingestion, you're taking the full JSON record as it is, which is basically a JSON version of the full meeting summary. Okay, which is not normalized. It's just throwing all of that at the and chunky. You're just chunking all of that, which is not very best practice because
And is this why it's called naive rack?
I would
Or
call
the
it, yeah,
naive?
I would call it naive rag because it's a bit like saying you are structure. Well, it's less naive than the most naive rag would be. Well, it wouldn't be rag. It would be just take a document and give it to a generative model. That's not rag at all. For example, that's the most naive. Okay. So that would be just saying, look at this data source and you tell me what you think. Okay, that's naive. Naive RAG would be here's some structure. So here's some structure. This is a JSON structure, so it has pairs, as you say. Like so, this work group is called this archive work group. It had this. It has meetings. So it seems like a database, but it's not. It's just pairs. That tells the RAG that these pairs mean that. So it has that to infer a context from. That's what I would call naive RAG. And it is still translating that into semantically, for want of a better word, using the FAST. This is the index, the standard index that's used for almost every local RAG, which the preprocessor. What is best practice to replace that with is to introduce a stage here in the ingestion flow, which will be SQL query, essentially. So basically, let's say you have a question where you might ask the question, well, it might be a question that SQL could answer. So it could be like, how many meetings, for example, has the archive work group done? Now, already that's going to be a problem for a semantic query because semantic queries have trouble with arithmetic, for example. They have trouble counting and stuff like that. So there's some things that are far more efficient to do in SQL, particularly if it's normalized. An SQL query's got no problem answering that. It can tell you instantly that in an SQL statement. Obviously, some questions
But
won't.
how does the query differentiate what
Yeah.
should be queried and
Well, what you do, you would create rules at the back end, which would so you would interpret that requires some natural language processing, but it's not as difficult as it sounds because you can use I can't remember. I think you use a kind of fast type index. So it would parse what you're saying. So, for example, it would know the difference between how many meetings has this work group done, and just rephrase it. Tell me this, how many meetings, different
so
phrasing to the
basically that
question.
would happen in the query embedding mode in the query flow you have there.
Yeah, it would take your question at the um,
Mm.
at the bot end and say, well, what does this question mean? Okay. In that case, it might use a generative model. It might use a generative model to do that. Because but it's very restricted. Its only job is to match it against what is possible, what can be possibly be asked at the back end. Okay. So it would say, I think this question means this. Question means this person wants to ask how many work group meetings there are, for example, of this particular work group, let's say, and then it would take that and or it would say, I don't understand your question. It might come back and I don't understand it. That's how restrictive it's going to be. This is also going to be, we're designing it in such a way that if it cannot answer the question or it cannot, it will come back saying, I don't know. But let's say it says, okay, this person wants to find out about archive work group and they want to know how many meetings. It will then be in a naive RAG, it will then look at the whole JSON. Okay. But in SQL, it will go to an SQL stage first. So say, can I run an SQL query that will answer that? And the answer would be yes or no, or it might be partly yes, partly needs some other information for some questions. So where it's yes, it will run the SQL query, which will be almost instant because that's very quick. And then it returns that data back to supplement the ingestion. So on its own, it might just take that SQL data and return it via FAS in a semantic wrapper. So the SQL will return something like some SQL response like two archive meetings or something. So you would then wrap that in semantics, so actually more user friendly. So you would say there were two art group meetings, to return that semantically to the front end. Does that help, Tivo?
Yep, it does.
Yeah.
Interesting. You have put so much documentation on just to
Yeah.
do that.
Well, I just what I'm trying to do here is not, it's a bit different from, I'm not interested in just taking a generative model and throwing information at it. What I'm trying to do here is something that can be audited. So, so every step of this is going to be the query submission. What is the query that you're submitting? What is it exactly? And I don't mean like this document. It's going to be this question, specifically this question, and then query will be embedded into, so use the query embedded into an embedding vector. Then there's local retrieval, which actually the reason why it's local is that it's this is quite a, if you think of it as like a bit of a stupid generative model. It's a very small generative model, but it doesn't need to be very big because all it does is retrieve a local embedding. All it has to know is about the local embedding. That retrieves text from the embedded index, which you created here, and it assembles a context. So assembling a context essentially like it's a bit like assembling a prompt, a bit like that. So it retrieves chunks assembled with the metadata in this case. But what I want to add to this is SQL queries. So it will actually might be SQL plus metadata for some queries, or sometimes it would just be SQL, for example. Then once you've done all this bit here, that's when the LNM, it goes to the LNM. So you've already answered the question here. Okay. All you're calling the LLM for, the LLM, I mean like a generative model like OpenAI or if we use ASI, whatever. All that's going to do is take the question that we've already answered and put a semantic wrapper around it. Yeah. So all it's going to do is make it so that it's like sounds like a human is answering the question. It's not actually answering the question. It's taking the answer and wrapping it in a response. Yeah. The other thing that this might be is a citation extraction. And this is why this is auditable. So not only does it answer the question, it will cite how it was answered. So it can prove to you, this question was answered using this source. Yeah. And then and also it'll actually check this as well. So if it can't find a source, it won't answer the question, basically. So let's say if you answer it, say it might say, it might say, I don't know, I don't have that information. Please ask the question again. Or let's say it might ask the question. Let's say if you ask the question, how many meetings does this work group have? And maybe the work group didn't have any meetings. That's unlikely, but in that case, it might say no evidence found or something. So that's a possibility, but that's something we would need to figure out how to work with. So you would then also, this actually has audit logging. The idea also will be ultimately to incorporate immutable logging. That refers to something like AR-weave or, but yeah, that's something more in the future. So the response would return the RAG query, complete with the output and the citations. So this is the valid. Let's see. So this documents the current. So this is going to change. Also, the reason why there's hashes associated with this, again, this might be familiar like to midnight or something, is so that the data can't there can't be a man in the middle. The data can't be tampered with as well. So and it's seeded so it can be reproduced as well. So it means that I mean, so yeah, so that's really what I'm doing there. So I'm not really sure if that answers all the questions. And Peter had to go. It's only us three.
No questions.
Yeah, the meeting summary template, we have to, so responding to what Svani is saying. What we have to look at there, and again, we need to talk about that between ourselves, like Vanny and Andre, and about what data is SQL data. And something that can seem straightforward. I mean, some obvious ones might be the name of a work group, for example. That's the name of a work group doesn't change, it's a fact, or the date of a meeting, for example, or the people who attend a meeting. Those are candidates for SQL, I would say. Some things are more ambiguous, like tags. Now, tags at first sight could be SQL entities, but do we want them to be that? Is that what we mean by tags? Let's say we want to think of tags in a more unstructured way in the future. Maybe we don't want to do that. Do you see what I mean?
Not really, no, because like to me, that's the point of a tag. It's
Yeah,
good structured data about the topics that were covered. So why would you want to view it in a more unstructured way? Are you just talking about the the fact that we haven't got a really rigid taxonomy? Is that what you mean?
yeah. I'm being a devil's advocate, really. I agree with you, really, because tags, even the name suggests something discrete, doesn't it? It suggests, even without a taxonomy. I suppose
Well, yeah,
more,
because I suppose there is like issues around semantic analysis around, what we've
yeah,
talked about, the fact that we've got quite a big taxonomy and we don't enforce anything, so somebody can add something that's almost a synonym as a new tag. So
yeah,
yeah, maybe that's part of it.
yeah. That's something else that can be done. Again, the first part of the meeting where we were talking about the work I haven't done, which is the graph analysis. That's where also semantic analysis could be done as well. I mean, we probably should get started on that as well. And that would be like a good case study for doing that would be taking the tags.
It's just that people tag really badly. So
Yeah,
I'm
but
just like, I think this could be part of an educational process on like how to do a meeting summary. If people see how, what kind of results you get from querying with a really thinly tagged corpus,
mm,
then they might learn that we need to tag a bit more fully. I don't know.
yeah, I have to think. Yeah, another reason why also I'm doing it this way, Tiba, which might interest you, this is all modular. So it means that it doesn't, I'm designing it in such a way that it doesn't have to just take in meeting summaries. It could take in any data as long as you define what that data is. So you could say, here is a JSON structure. So it would take in that our account, it could take
Yeah,
in,
I understand the development method.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So it would take in your treasury data, for example. Yeah.
Yeah.
It could take in that. And also that's the reason why it's so conservative, it's so structured, because it would audit the data as well. So you could say, take this treasury data, take these figures, and I'm not sure what data backend you're using for treasury, but let's say it's SQL, for example. You could say, run this data in such a way and only run the data in such a way to answer questions about it. Yeah. And you could plug that in to the same system. You see what I mean? And then also you would then could create cross-referencing between those as well. That's I'm designing it in such a way, well, it's kind of a standard design, as you know, but it's designed in such a way so it can actually plug in other sources. Um,
Yeah. Regarding trying, because I have operationally tried to like use that data for reporting and stuff.
yeah,
But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, results are pretty crap, and I think the only way to solve that is to use some kind of like, yeah, like you mentioned, like RAG model or something that understands the context of how
yeah,
all these things are related to each other.
yeah,
Because directly that data is just
yeah.
it
I
doesn't, it
suppose
can't get it.
that's another thing you can pre-process, and you're spot on with the graph rag. And again, that's something that's missing from that screen share, which I did because there was no graph rag in that. But that you could do is a similar graph rag could be another a graph method. You've seen graphs of complex data, of course, so where you see relationships between things. But you don't have to look at that graphically. You could also look at that in terms of data. So you could just do it like a query. So, for example, let's say nearness of things like centrality. I'm trying to think of a treasury example. So, what's the cluster of payments around a person? Let's say, yeah, and you could see that on a graph, and it would show you graphically what that was. But also, you could then design that as a query. So it would tell you the same information, but in a come back as like a JSON type structure.
Yeah.
Fanny, Fanny, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, in our last meeting a while ago now, we were talking about how the kind of the graph work that you were doing, Stephen, was kind of revealing really similar information about influence and participation and so on and so forth as what we got in treasury data and all that.
Yeah,
I'm just wondering, like, yes, if you had some sort of unified system where you were kind of plugging in different data sources, then a graph would have to understand how they were related. But is there also something about keeping them separate so you can kind of say, well, look, we're getting this data from this data source and this data from here, and we're seeing similar or different. Say like for instance, if something that looked at meeting summaries was showing us one kind of pattern of influence and participation, and treasury data was showing us something else, as in basically those who were most influential are not paid,
yeah.
or whatever it might be. I suppose that's the kind of thing I'm asking is like, how much do you want to unite the different sources of data and how much do you want to keep them separate?
I guess sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. And also it needs to be. That's why it needs to be modular. So let's say we got a data dump from TiVo for treasury data, however what that looks like in a JSON file or whatever, or a spreadsheet or something, and we plug that into the system. Then we plug that in the system and it can be processed through a pipeline. We have to, uh, we'll have to liaise with Treasury to make sure it understands what that data means, but that could be quite straightforward. And then we could choose how the question, as you say, Vanny, we could choose. You could either do that at the prompt level, so you could say, tell me information about the archive work group, but only take data from archive records, for example. Or you could ask a general question, like tell me information about the archive work group. And it'd be such a general question, it would go away and come back and take it from all of its sources. So that's where the question of a design maybe come into it, because maybe you don't want it to default to that.
Yeah, because I suppose I'm just thinking maybe there's an ethics involved in humans being the ones to look at the data that is returned and determine whether there are connections or not, rather than assuming that there are.
Yeah, I think in that case, Treasury might be a bad example because there's a lot of, well, there's privileged information there, which is also it might affect or for identity, things like that. And as you say, ethical issues. So it may be not such a good. I think you would have to be careful about how you ingested Treasury
Mm.
data, particularly also how you, not only how you ingested it, but also how you compared it with
Yeah.
archive data.
I suppose what I'm thinking is I'm trying to think a bit more generically. If this system was taken to a completely different ecosystem where they've got different data sources than we have, and just like how you would enable another ecosystem to use it without making any assumptions that data is connected or similar when it actually might not be, and like how you enable them to use it in order to discover connections rather than assume them. I
Yeah,
don't think I'm being awfully clear, but do you get me?
I get you. That's kind of that adds a certain level of sophistication. So it's a bit like adding a, well, it is like adding a process, a human review process. And I suppose that's the dream of graphs. Approaching that, there's a couple, what I've found, I'm not sure what you found, Tivo, or anyone else who's used graphs, is that there's a bit of a learning curve there with people, you know, so do people understand what graph centrality means? Do they understand what clusters mean? That kind of thing. So I'm trying to think of ways in which that can be translated into things that non-technical people could review, maybe. And that's why I designed that dashboard with very simple graphs. But I think it needs more thought. I'm not really sure. I don't really have a direct answer to that.
Hello, Sharmila.
Hello, Shamla.
Where did you come from?
Hey, Shamila.
But yeah, maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I should. I mean, because I'm not really. I should be thinking more about um, stepping back and thinking, well, where's the human in the loop? And there's an ethic because the other thing we can design is a kind of I don't want to use the word constitution, necessarily, but like a policy. So we, again, that's something that can be done between our peers, between us, to decide, you know, and we can add that so it can constrain the RAG process. The RAG process at the moment just is a data model and an ingestion pipeline. So it just ingests data in, it audits, it does it all in a very auditable way. That's very good, but it doesn't have any human in the loop at the moment. But you could add a human in the loop by introducing that as a policy. And maybe that's what we need to focus on, Banning.
Yeah, and maybe sort of rather than obviously we wouldn't be imposing that and baking it into the system, but maybe it's something that could be part of an add-on that if it is a generic thing that could be used in other ecosystems, just having some process for how they work that out and how they do it in
Yeah.
consulting their community or because we've had quite a lot of thought about that, haven't we? And that's something I think we could usefully um comment on.
Yes.
Yeah. So funny enough, it's a bit of, it reminds me of a midnight proposal a little bit, but but the where you have, I mean, the ingestion. I can think of a use case already. Let's say we have names, like so questions are answered about we have names in the archive, we have names in Treasury. Okay. Now, arguably, there's a consent issue there. Okay, so let's say before we released the information, um, I mean, there would be a process of user acceptance, let's say, and you could define that in a policy. Yeah. So that policy can be detached. So you could just do it without the policy, but then you could add the policy. The policy would say, if you find these entities in the data, and if, for example, if you find a user entity in the data, that any query must have the sign of that entity, for example.
Mhm.
Um, so, and once you had that sign off, then you could run it forever. Okay, so it'd be like a contract.
I
Yeah,
wouldn't even say maybe forever, maybe it's like a quarterly plan. People need
yeah,
to consent to the archival workgroup proposal in order to get
yeah,
query result from
yeah.
people.
Yeah, I think it's a bit like we've been discussing in Midnight about rational privacy. So let's say treasury queries like tell me everything this person earned is maybe, well, maybe you want a rational question to that where some of that information is hidden and some of it is public. What information do you want public? And also not only that, but what consents do you need? And also from an ethical AI is also the element of understanding, isn't there, Vanny? Where people have to understand how their data was interpreted.
Yeah, basically informed consent in retrospect. It's like you give your
Yeah,
consent, you have to have, that has to be informed. But also, we can't really do that with a lot of AI processes because we're not really fully sure how it's going to work and what we're going to get. So then there's like a retrospective consent that says, yeah, I understand how that has been processed. And for me, that the sort of citation element that your process is enabling, it's very important for obviously for archive queries that you can cite, but also for any kind of consent process. It's quite important that you can see where, if it is a RAG process and it is constrained, that you should be able to see where it's got its answer from and
mm,
yeah, what it's used in order to fully consent to it. It's interesting. It seems to raise questions about consent can't be fully in advance. It reminds me a little bit of when you do um, something like interviewing or whatever. You ask the person for consent to use the interview after the interview is finished because if you asked before, they don't know what they're going to say, so or what you're going to ask or how the conversation is going to go. And I think any use of AI, it feels really similar to me. You don't really know what it's going to come up with and how
yeah, yeah.
until it's done it.
Well, in a way, it's complicated even further with more subtle statistical analysis, like graphs, for example, because a graph would tell you won't tell you it won't. It's not like the answer to an SQL query. It's something. It's more like proximate data, like clusters of things or relationships between things. And arguably, you can debate about what that means. So like for example, meeting attendance. A meeting attendance could show very large clusters around a person who attended a lot of meetings, but that doesn't tell you the whole story about that cluster. So, and that could lead to a mislead. It does provide you with empirical information and it's statistical on one level, but it may need to be qualified by other information. So that,
Yeah, it's like that cross-referencing issue that we were just talking about. I mean, let's say the information that you have in a summary about who was at a meeting doesn't tell you who took part
yeah,
and who participated.
exactly.
But I think what I'm struggling with it to understand is how, presumably we do in some instances have that data about who participates, like governance work group tries to put something on DWork to say who spoke in like physically or in chat, and they are the participants rather than the attendees. But teaching a RAG process how to combine those two sources, who was present and who participated, feels like it would be complex.
Yeah, I would also,
Yeah, this is where I think what Stefan showed before was where you do this like pre like you prepare the environment for like to fill up the like like the rules of the game, like how do you interpret the data. So and with the RAG model it's like a modular in a sense that you just attach new rules on top of that, and and then perhaps even it only like the same way as MCP servers work. They just queries through all the functions and sees what is relevant and then just executes what's relevant. So he knows all the rules, but he doesn't execute all the rules if this is not needed
Yeah,
in that instance.
exactly. And you would create different, it's all, think of it a bit like different templates actually. So let's say something like sentiment analysis or quarterly reports or people's scoring of participation, for example. Those, if you think of those as opinions, if you like, or points of view, okay, and they're going to be like they're going to have their own structure. So, so a quarterly report will, have an approximate structure. So what you would do, you would say, okay, let's take that data and put it through the data pipeline, the ingestion pipeline. There needs to be some process of verification there where someone is going to have to sign off on it to a human in a loop to say the RAG is interpreting the quarterly reports in the correct way. Yeah. And then it can, as you say, Tibo, it can join like an MCP, it can join into a pipe, it can be connected to be a source of information for a generative model. Same with a sentiment survey. So you would take the sentiment survey and say, this is a sentiment survey. This is what it means, or this is what and then you can plug it in as well. So, I mean, you get, I mean, that's kind of the benefit, but also the danger, I suppose, because you could end up with quite I suppose you'd have to be careful about auditing what you're plugging in. And I think that's why I'm focusing very much on hashing the data that goes in, so you make sure it's not tampered with the data. That's the other thing. So, so that you are, so you can unintentionally corrupt data as well. So, yeah. I mean, a controversial element with participate. I mean, I suppose participation is another subjective data, isn't it? I mean, for example, you could take the transcript of a meeting, and that is empirical data, and it tells you who spoke. But we're not, so again, there are ethical issues around that. But so returning back to what you reminded me of at the beginning of the meeting, I suppose we need to give some attention to, I'm thinking of human in the loop, really. So, we will redesign the system. We have an ingestion, but what's the policy? So I suppose, what should we call it? Should we call it a policy? Or what do you think, Danny?
I mean, it feels like it's possibly more than one policy, but I think for me, it's more about process. It's more about how an organization would implement um, the ethical principle that there needs to be a human in the loop. It's like I can imagine in different scenarios, you might need the human to do different things, and they might need to verify different things. And also, depending on the level of decentralization of the community, it might be more, oh, everybody can validate this, or only people with certain roles would have the knowledge to validate this, or whatever. So it's more about how should an organization implement this to suit their specifics. And I think, we could, even though we're really only doing it in this environment, I think we could definitely think through how it might work more generically and what would need to be considered.
Right. Since you mentioned validation, because these validations here are programmatic, but we could insert a review validation. So I think that's what we need to think about really. So, and also how it applies to state transitions.
Can you
How,
just zoom in a little bit on the validation rules?
try, hold on. Oh,
Oh,
is that
yeah, next one. Yeah, that's better.
okay? And this is a bit jargon, but this just means workflow state transition. So submitted, embedded. So here we would have something human in the loop in the state transition. So well, I don't know. This is more about data. State transition would actually more apply to data ingestion. So trying to think again, validation rules here, and so I need to think about what role.
Yeah, it sort of feels like maybe this is too early in the process for the sort of human validation that we're talking about. It's more like when you start doing graph analysis and then taking it to the community to say, all right, does this make sense? It's like what we were saying in the last meeting, that we should have a session where we sit down and look at some of the outputs of this analysis and ask people if it accords with their actual experience of being in the program.
Okay, and that's in the dashboard, isn't it? So I need to check that actually and have a look at that and give it some thought, really. So, because yeah,
Well, it's like, do you remember in the last meeting where you were showing some of the outputs of things like, some of the graph analysis specifics that you've done and just asking people, what do you think that means?
yeah, I think that's what I suppose it's about trying to, where do we start and what do we do? I suppose I was thinking I was getting a bit ahead of myself because I was getting away from delivering or functioning RAG, so but I suppose you just pointed that out, haven't you? It's kind of we need to produce to build something first, okay, to
Exactly.
to meet people's expectations, and we're doing that. So we do, but we have to qualify what we're delivering.
Mhm.
We're just going to deliver, first of all, a basic RAG. It's not that basic actually, because it is quite sophisticated because it's going to be audited and grounded. So, but it's not going to include graph data at this stage. So, but it also, what it does need is a policy applied to it, even at this stage, actually. So, yeah, that's something I need to think about. Trying to think if I've got. Um, so, say human auditability. It doesn't really. I've reduced the ability to audit things, but I haven't shown how it can be audited particularly. So there's a audit logging, but that needs to be more hands-on, doesn't it, really? I think.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, and I think there's questions about whether it's on an individual basis, like you ask a query, you audit the results, or whether it's a community activity.
Yeah. I actually have created a policy outline, but it's called a constitution. I don't know but the but the so this is the kind of thing, truth-bound intelligence. Um, but again,
I mean, explainability should be in there, shouldn't it, really? Tell you what
yeah,
we need to do. You know that draft I started of an AI ethics policy for record keeping and archiving?
yeah,
We need to kind of maybe work that in together into this,
yeah, that'd be
or work
great.
this into it, or whatever.
explainability is definitely missing, isn't it? There's
Yeah, yeah, I think
test
it is.
audit, yeah, it's just
I mean, in a
audit.
sense, auditability and transparency is explainability, but I think it's just that it's quite a common term that is used in like ethics contexts with AI that yeah.
Yeah, I think that's something. I mean, that can be interesting because that can be programmatically interpreted. So um, if you can come up with that, and then I can try and run it through some simulations, we might be able to get some sort of process for explainability. This is very audit orientated, isn't
Which
it?
is,
Yeah,
okay, but I think
yeah,
yeah, it's just different terms. I mean, looking at reproducibility and determinism, these are scientific method basics as well. And
mm,
it feels like this whole question of the ambassador program as a governance experiment or a series of governance experiments feels like this is another experiment and maybe, you know,
yeah.
can be framed that way.
And that's what that key there, that here, in my, any inference that comes out through a prompt must produce, must reproduce the source. So that's basically it, really. So it can't lie, basically. It can't hallucinate. It's not allowed to. So
There is the question, though, that comes to mind about the quality of summaries, which all this is based on searching.
yeah,
And I think we raised it in the last meeting and the meeting before that, that, sometimes people find it difficult and summary quality is not great. So that's almost like the human version of hallucination. People will write down that things were said that were not said, or they'll phrase it in such a way that it means something different than what was actually
mm,
said.
mm,
And I still think we need to revisit the so-called experiment that we've had of not auditing meeting summaries anymore since February.
yeah,
We've done that. And it would be really interesting to try and pull out some comparisons with some of these processes between old data and new data and just see if it makes a difference or not. Because
yeah,
what we're trying to get to is something that will help people document their work, even, or their community, even if they don't find documentation very easy.
yeah,
And I think some of this is about the redesign of meeting summary templates so that we don't enable vast swathes of unstructured data in a section called narrative. But maybe if we ask people more specifically and give them more clues on what they need to write where, so that these processes can find that information and compare it, make connections. Because just backtracking to what we were talking about before about SQL queries versus ones that would before would be more suitable for a
yeah,
RAG query. It feels to me like SQL queries are things that look at one field in the JSON or whatever
yeah,
format it's in, and SQL query, sorry, and RAG queries need to take information from different sources, different
yeah.
fields, and look at combine.
I suppose the canonical difference is an SQL query is deterministic, and a RAG query, sorry, an LNM is semantic. And each has its strengths and rate. For example, you can't count things very well semantically.
Yeah.
But
No, that is true, but
yeah,
and obviously that is the canonical difference. But
yeah,
I just think there is more to it than that.
probably, yeah. Unfortunately, this is rather it's called truth-bound intelligence. I think that kind of overstates the intelligence of humans a little bit because, as you pointed out, hallucinations can happen from the human side in a sense. They're not really hallucinations, they're more errors, or I don't know what would you call them, or just
Yeah,
I don't want to be, I'm trying to be polite. Yeah. So,
fabrications maybe.
but you could actually incorporate that within the policy here. So we might, so for example, particularly with pre-processing or auditing, human auditing I'm referring to now. So let's say, because we have I mean, we probably should leave some of the records unaudited by you, I mean.
Oh, we have. That's the
Yeah,
experiment we're
yeah.
running.
And you need to know what they are. And then
Anything since February.
yeah, that should probably be high on my task list because that'll tell you very interesting information.
I mean, obviously, it's not pure, is it? Because we
No,
do have that process in most work groups where people will post a Google Doc generated from the meeting summary tool for corrections,
right.
and people will chip in. But even even then, yeah, particularly I think with tagging, I'm not kind of doing what I used to do with going in and adding relevant tags and yeah, I'm not
Yeah.
checking the dates are correct. I'm not checking that people who are supposed to have been there actually were there.
We can actually do a lot of that, like things like date correction could be done programmatically, couldn't it? So,
I'd love it to be, but I think there's always been glitches with that because I don't see how you would do it unless you linked it. No,
mm,
because even if you linked it to the calendar, sometimes what is on the calendar is not what actually happens.
no, I did include a topic modeling algorithm. I can't remember doing that, but I so entity extraction as well.
I mean, with
Yeah.
topic modeling, is that something that tags are useful for? Because I just feel like we're not using them enough.
Yeah, I did. I can't, so I've got so much things going on. I can't remember doing this, but I did do something on this. I'm trying to remember what it was now. Let's look at the data. Benchmarks, issue reports, sample, existing data. No. Um, tests. Test integration. Test consultation and or compliance. No. I'd have to dig into that, but I do recall. I mean, I've got it in there in the features, so I did do something on that, but I can't remember what I did. Sorry,
No, it's fine.
yeah, yeah,
I'm just looking at the time and wondering if we should like switch the recording off because like we're getting more discursive now and it would be just boring for people
yeah.
watching the recording, but maybe there are questions that people want to raise.
Any official questions people want to make for the recording? If not, I say thank you for the recording, people, and I'll stop the recording.